Good morning. Good morning. I'm Mike Larissy from the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and it's a special pleasure for me to be here today because it was almost exactly 10 years ago to the date that we used this venue to launch Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity, and it's been quite a ride. Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity got its start at a Council on Foundations meeting in May 2007, when a number of us funders, foundation folks, and some poverty experts, Mark Greenberg, Jody Levin-Epstein from Class Shelley, sort of conceived of the need to elevate poverty and opportunity as a political agenda. We were looking at the upcoming election, the 2008 election, and we weren't hearing anything about poverty and opportunity. It just wasn't being talked about. They were talking about recessions and bailouts and things, but no one was talking about poverty. So we decided to undertake a couple of things to elevate the issue, to put it more on the agenda. And the first thing we did was create a website, Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity. It was launched in 2007, October 2007, and the focus for that first year was on getting presidential candidates, all the presidential candidates, to engage on the issue. So that was the initial idea. We reached out to all the presidential candidates, both sides, very bipartisan, and asked them to submit videos or statements. We asked a series of questions. We tried to get questions posed to them in various venues, but we wanted to get them on the record. I think one of the exciting things about Spotlight is throughout its 10 years, it's been rigorously and almost religiously bipartisan. I mean, we really take it as a prime directive is to be, strictly bipartisan, create a big tent, a safe place for folks of all different views from all different sides of the question to engage on it. I mean, we've had original commentary from Newt Gingrich and Nancy Pelosi. We featured James Q. Wilson and William Julius Wilson. So, I mean, we really try to reach out and get the best from everyone on all sides of the issue. And, back in 2007, we knew we were doing something important, but we didn't really think it could be sustained. We weren't sure about that, but 10 years later, here we are. So after the election, Spotlight transitioned to what it is today. Right? We changed the tagline from Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity, America asks the presidential candidates what they'll do for us, to Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity, the source for news, ideas, and action. So we thought, well, after the campaign is over, let's keep this thing going. We're having a lot of fun, and people are paying attention. We're getting viewers. So we transitioned, and now I guess our newsletter goes out to almost 10,000 people every week. Spotlight is the source for news, ideas, and action. It is one stop. You go there, and you can look to everything. We do a real good job of aggregation from New York Times, from dozens and dozens of media outlets. We solicit original content, original journalism. We have some really fine pieces that Bill has pulled together some great reporters to do for us and then for other newspapers and other venues. We have blog posts, events, videos, webinars, and so much more. Anything to create interest in this set of issues. We'll engage in all sorts of different ways, and we also try to partner with a lot of people. We've partnered with AEI, American Enterprise Institute, and the Brookings Institution, Opportunity Nation and Opportunity America, CAPS Half in 10 and Poverty, Talk Poverty, Center for Public Justice, a more conservative organization, the Clapham Group, a former Chief of Staff to Rick Santorum, many, many more. So we occupy a niche in this ecosystem that I think we can contribute a great deal to. We inform policymakers and we give them what they need to make smart decisions. Spotlight has the support of many funders over the years, and I think they're listed here. We've been very fortunate to get a sustained support from 5 anchor funders who have committed in 5-year increments to the project. In addition to the Casey Foundation, we have the Ford Foundation, JPB Foundation, that's John and Barbara Pickauer, and the Kellogg Foundation, and an anonymous donor. So we've been very fortunate. We're thrilled to be celebrating our 10th anniversary with you today, and we're looking forward to our second decade. For the first decade, from 9 of those years, the the Herd of Cats was led by Jody Levin-Epstein from CLASP, who's just been fabulous. And now we're going to the second year, and Shelley Waters Boots, a good colleague and one of the people who were involved in starting this, is leading the team. And you know, it's nice to have some new blood, but a lot of continuity. I think that during this time of extreme polarization, I mean, things are really, really bad. Spotlight is more important than ever. You know, it provides a safe place. We bring in people from both sides, and it's always civil. You know, I disagree with a lot of the stuff I see in Spotlight, but I'm glad it's there. You know, and we need that today, and we're going to need it for the next several years more than ever. We're always trying to think of ways to elevate the discourse, the issues that we care about. You're going to hear next about an evaluation done by the Spotlight team looking at media's coverage on poverty. We've done this intermittently over the 10 years we've been with the project to see where media is and what's happening, and you know how much folks are paying attention to the set of issues, watching it increase and decrease. We've launched, as I mentioned, an exclusive journalism project commissioning journalists to cover stories for us. And we've gotten some great pieces, and we're going to get some more. We're planning our future to think of how we can add value. And you know, always thinking, we meet monthly, and we always try to figure out ways to contribute more. So with that, I'd like to introduce Bill Nichols, a member of the Spotlight team and a former managing editor of Politico, who will share with you the findings of our study. Bill?
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everybody. Appreciate everybody being here. Mike is a very humble guy, so one thing he didn't really stress is his role in Spotlight. He's very much at the heart of this enterprise and has been just a huge presence in the poverty field as a whole. So Mike, thanks for everything that you've done. So as Mike said, we feel that we're definitely bringing value at Spotlight in terms of coverage of these issues, but we periodically want to hold the rest of the media accountable, so that's what we've done with this latest evaluation. And the Spotlight team has tried to look at how frequently poverty is being covered under a variety of terms to assess how the media is doing today as opposed to 10 years ago. And as with this whole event, to really underline the need in all of our minds for more innovative ways to cover this topic. We're doing some interesting things, but we can certainly do better. So we did a media scan through Nexus of 7 major publications looking at 3 major terms, poverty, low income, and income inequality, again, comparing between this year and 2007. So basically, there's some good news and there's some not such great news, or at least room for improvement. The most positive findings that we have come around stories that look at poverty through the lens of income inequality. Obviously, an increasing problem in our country, probably certainly a more expansive frame for media organizations to use rather than looking just at deep poverty. So we saw substantial increases for the New York Times and the Washington Post, at least some increases for everybody else other than the Wall Street Journal that stayed about the same. The less positive news comes with coverage using the other terms, poverty and low income. And here we don't see the sort of increases that we would like. We see increases again for the New York Times and the Post. On low income, to some extent, a very marginal increase for the Wall Street Journal, but decreases everywhere else. And we want to also be clear that even in the cases that we're seeing increases, if you look at the number of stories that deal with any of these topics and the aggregate total of stories that these outlets are doing, it's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction. So that is certainly reason for concern and reason for all of us to look for ways to do a better job of doing this. We then want to pivot and look through a lens that's particularly important to me, as someone who was in journalism for 35 years and started at a little newspaper in Jackson, Mississippi, way back when in the dark ages. And that is the trends that are impacting local journalism generally and as it pertains to the coverage of poverty. I think it's easy for those of us who live on the coast to be in our media bubble where topics like these probably get much more coverage than they do in Lexington, Kentucky, or Jackson, Mississippi, or Charleston, West Virginia. And it's a story that will not be terribly new to you, but one that I want to underline just because it grows worse virtually every day, and that's the hollowing out of local journalism. Most local newsrooms are being halved, sometimes cut by 3/4, and these are often the largest media outlets in the state. And just to give you a personal reflection on that, I mentioned Jackson, Mississippi. I went to work there in 1980, and even that relatively small newspaper had close to 100 people on staff. And enough that in 1983, the paper was able to do an extensive investigative series on the state of education in Mississippi and combine that with a very bare-knuckled editorial campaign. We actually urged readers to call legislators at home. It's when people still talk to each other on the phone, and raise hell and urge them to vote for an education reform package that ultimately passed. And among other things, established mandatory kindergarten in Mississippi for the first time, something that had been viewed as sort of a socialist integrationist plot. And the paper won the Pulitzer Prize for that in 1983. That same Jackson paper now has 29 people total on staff, 6 of whom cover sports. And this is in a state that has the highest poverty rate in the country, has the endemic, historic, generational poverty in the Mississippi Delta, and there's basically really no one covering that. So to further illustrate that point, we tried to look at the newsrooms of the major news organizations in the states that have the 10 states with the highest poverty rates, and none of them have a dedicated reporter to cover poverty. Many of them have other interesting staffing arrangements. Arkansas Online in Little Rock has a sports recruiting columnist, no one to cover poverty. In Jackson, as I mentioned, of that 29-person staff, 6 of them cover sports. And then at the Oklahoman, while there's no poverty reporter, there are 17 sports reporters. So what resources there are, unfortunately, are not being used in ways that cover the issues that we care about. I'm an optimistic person, and there are signs of hope in this space, and I want to hold those up and commend everyone here to support them and really be pushing for everyone in this field to look for new ways that we can have more impact. There are nonprofit newsrooms springing up across the country. There's one in Mississippi that's been there for a couple of years, probably not what it should be at this point, but certainly is a start, and particularly is supplying some state capital coverage that the state was really missing. There are a couple of really interesting efforts underway to try to bring new resources to local newsrooms, one from ProPublica, one from Report for America. It's going to be really interesting to see how those play out. And then finally, in our terrific panel, we'll talk about this a little bit when they come up, there is the philanthropic impact on journalism, and just one example I would use is Kaiser Health News, which has become a incredibly respected journalistic entity. When they were first coming around and I was the managing editor at Politico, there was some reluctance to run their stuff because there was the feeling that this was journalism that was supported by philanthropy, and was that really objective? That barrier, I think, is completely gone as far as KHN is concerned, and I think opens the possibility for others to build similar operations. We're extremely grateful for the Casey Foundation's support for our fledgling journalism operation at Spotlight, and we would love to follow in those footsteps. So with that, again, I want to thank everyone for being here. I know these are issues that we all care about. And I'm going to bring Clarence Page up to introduce our panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bill. When you were giving us figures about the current state of our industry, and speaking of personnel on the news side compared to sports, I'm reminded of back when I was a younger reporter, and this is true. I was talking to one of our senior management people, because we always making fun of the sports guys. You know, they're over there with their bags all packed for the next Super Bowl. And but as he pointed out to me, 40% of our revenue was coming in because of sports. So I said, well, I see why they get some respect around here. But you know, sports is a consistent story, unlike President Trump, and every day you can rely on on having a sports story and that sort of thing, and the audience out there. And when I look at the numbers for a sports columnist compared to the hits that I get as an op-ed columnist, I am indeed reminded of the story of Rupert Murdoch, when he bought the Chicago Sun-Times back in the 80s, was questioned in a news conference about, Mr. Murdoch, how do you respond to the charge that your newspapers tend to be sensationalist? And he responded, we prefer to say exciting. So I said, we build excitement, kind of like a car commercial, you know? But this is the nature of our business now. I'm so happy to have a wonderful panel here that's going to help to enlighten me as well as to current state of life out on the front lines, covering issues of poverty and other economic pressures on the family these days. I'm going to call you up one at a time, since I've got all of you right here at the table with me. Number one, I'm going to call up Tamar Jacoby, who she and I were just reminiscing about past panels that we've been on over the years. She is now president of Opportunity America, a Washington-based nonprofit working to promote economic mobility. A former journalist and author, she was senior writer and justice editor at Newsweek, and before that, the deputy editor of the New York Times op-ed page. And she's her articles have appeared just about every reputable medium that you can imagine. In any case, among other creations, she's the author of Someone Else's House, America's Unfinished Struggle for Integration, and editor of Reinventing the Melting Pot, The New Immigrants and What It Means to Be American. And we were just gabbing away about how much the immigration issue has evolved over just the last decade alone. Next, I'm going to call up Marisol Bello from the Center for Community Change. Marisol is Director of Content Strategies and Development at the Center for Community Change, a national social justice organization that seeks to empower people in low-income communities, especially those of color. She directs a team of writers, videographers, photographers, and social media strategists who tell the stories of real people affected by economic inequality. Next, come on up, Sam. Sam Baker from Axios, the deputy healthcare editor at Axios, which is based here in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining Axios, he covered the Supreme Court and legal affairs with an emphasis on politically significant cases and issues. And next, I'm going to ask Laura McGann from Vox. She's editorial director at Vox.com, a digital publication dedicated to explaining the news. She ran Vox's politics and policy coverage during the 2016 presidential race. You lucky woman, you. And she came to Vox from Politico, where she served as the managing editor of Politico Pro during the 2012 election, and got her start in journalism covering bankruptcy for the Dow Jones Newswire. And finally, last but not least, Jesse Holland. Jesse Holland is the race and ethnicity reporter for the Associated Press, responsible for coverage and analysis of this nation's minority and ethnic groups for the world's largest news organization. I had to get that in there, didn't you? Of course, former Supreme Court, White House, and congressional reporter, Jesse was named one of TheRoot.com's 100 most influential African Americans in 2011, and University of Mississippi's list of top 50 journalism graduates. He's got an extensive resume, but the part I really love, Jesse, I got to jump right to it. He is also the author of the new Star Wars young adult book, Star Wars: The Force Awakens, Finn's Story. I didn't know that. Where can I get a copy?
Anywhere.
Is that on sale now? Good, good.
Anywhere.
Come
Buy
back.
3. They go for Christmas.
You're going to be a big hit in our house, I want to tell you. That's great. Well, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause for our panel for being here with us today. I'm going to begin with a question to each of you to help familiarize you with our audience and vice versa, to ask what your media organization or organization approaches in covering poverty issues, how each of you do that. And I'm going to I'm going to skip over Tamar for a moment and go right to Sam, because I like to for you to explain to everybody who's not familiar with Axios what it is and how you approach poverty issues.
Sure. So Axios is a relatively new media organization. We I always forget if it's one day younger or one day older than the Trump administration, but right around the same time there. And you can probably intuit a lot just from reading the site, if you do, about sort of our approach to journalism. It is a policy and politics focused news outlet. But in terms of poverty, I think it's not, we don't have a dedicated poverty report or anything like that, but it's something that we come at from several different angles. I work on healthcare. There's obviously a lot of coverage of Medicaid, of CHIP, of the Affordable Care Act, those sorts of programs. We have another policy vertical, a newsletter called The Future of Work, which writes about automation, where jobs are going, how they're changing, these sorts of things that all, I think, are component parts of sort of the broader story of poverty. And one other thing that we do that I think is sort of unique to Axios, you'll see if you read our stories a lot of times, just a bolded subhead that says why it matters, and then a little paragraph. And that's something that we want to communicate very explicitly for our readers, but also is is something that we apply pretty ruthlessly internally in our own news judgment. To say, we're all sort of on Twitter all day and all following the same stories that a lot of people in Washington are following, and sometimes something comes up and you start to write a post, and then you get to write out the why it matters, and well, it kind of doesn't, right? Like, this doesn't actually affect anyone's life. This is just sort of a little thing. I'll go ahead and trash that one and move on. And so we try to internally and externally have a very straight, not implicit. You don't have to read between the lines what this means for real people, for their lives, and to do that in those coverage areas like healthcare, work, automation, all of that, to try to pull all that together in one place.
Good, thank you very much. I'm going to put the same question to Laura McGann. Let me say Vox and Axios are both web pages that I go to religiously because I am a pundit, and as everyone knows, when you're a pundit here in Washington, you go anywhere you can for leads and for inspiration and for really lively debates, and you've got both, but I'm still getting used to this age of BuzzFeed. I still come out of the age of typewriters, so I'm I'm very happy to hear your explanations of what you do. And Laura, over at Vox, how would you describe your approach to covering poverty issues?
Sure. So for people who maybe aren't so familiar with Vox.com, we launched a few years ago, and the premise of our news organization is the idea that there's this emphasis on new in the news, that if something just happened, that is the thing that's going to matter the most. But the problem with that is if you haven't maybe been following along, for weeks and weeks, maybe you're not reading Sam Baker and what's going on in healthcare, and you just catch up at this pivotal moment, you're missing the significance of the story because the emphasis is placed on so-and-so said this, or this person is going to vote for this. So what we're trying to provide, and just to say I rely on Sam and Axios for my work every day, but what we're trying to do is help a national audience understand big news events, big stories, and the way that we do that is we are trying to help people catch up on the story, but really understand why it matters and how we got there. So in terms of covering poverty, a lot of what we're doing in our coverage is trying to explain structural problems that get us to where we are today. And that to us is a value. It's sort of the moral core of what we do. But in a more, I suppose, self-interested way, what we found is there is a huge audience of people who want to know about this. We're seeing a generation of younger readers coming to our site because they care about inequality, they care about fairness, they care about racial disparity, and when we write about those topics, people read them, they share them, they respond to us, and they become loyal readers. So for us, there is this moral question about why, how is policy affecting the poor? How do people become poor in the first place, intergenerationally? Where are these disparities coming from? We also try to run pieces, perhaps, that try to have a discussion around how do you solve them. But at the end of the day, this is not an add-on for us. It's the core of our business model. So that's our approach.
Thank you very much. And Jesse, AP needs no introduction. But these days, though, how does AP approach poverty coverage? And you, on your beat, how do you approach it?
Well, one of the things that should have been obvious to us in journalism years ago that we're sort of getting to now is the idea of convergence. Because in the past, and I'm going to throw a bunch of journalistic jargon here that I'll try to explain. In the past, at AP especially, everything was siloed, which meant that sports did sports, economics did economics, politics did politics, race and ethnicity did race and ethnicity, and you didn't talk to anybody on the other teams. But now we've learned that everything's connected. Politics is connected to, these days, sports. Politics is connected to education, which is connected to immigration, which is connected to economics, which is connected to employment. So what we've learned at AP is that all of our teams have to talk to each other. So when we have a race and ethnicity team at AP now, and when we meet every Tuesday, we include an editor from our economics team, our editor from our education team, an editor from our political team. So we've learned that all of our stories have to have an infusion of all of these other topics, which now include economics and poverty. So whenever we write about an issue, we have an expert from another team come and say, hey, well, this is how this affects it. So for example, when I write about education, I have to talk to the economics team to find out about what the economic situation is in the area in which we're writing, especially when we're writing about public schools. So we've learned that issues about employment, economics, and policy have to be connected with all of the stories that we write. So we don't write just about race and ethnicity. We write about race and ethnicity. We write about the economics of the issue. We write about the poverty levels of the communities we're writing about. For example, we're working on stories about Detroit and Route 1, the Route 1 corridor from Detroit out west. In addition to writing about the highway, we have to write about the economic situation of people who live off the highway. So we're learning that all of these issues have to be addressed to have a complete story about any one topic. So we're now trying to converge all of our teams into basically one big AP where we can make sure we hit all of those issues. But especially in the future, poverty, because I think one of the great writers said that race would be the issue of this century. Well, class and poverty probably will be the issue of the next. So we have to start preparing ourselves to write about some of these issues. And so we're trying to get started on that now.
Indeed. One thing about all three of you, your organizations have, I was looking back after everybody was surprised by Donald Trump's victory in November, including Donald Trump, as far as I could tell. I look back, and all three of your organizations in different ways were talking about income inequality and talking about the economic devastation and the psychological and the social and emotional devastation that has occurred, the traumas evidenced by opiate addiction rates, et cetera. This was all going on out there, but nobody was putting it together in a way that fed back into giving us an indication that this might be some kind of a trend election or some kind of a pivotal event. So I'm very happy all three of you are here today to address this. And at the same time, Tamar Jacoby and I were talking earlier about how the media cover poverty and how this particular poll, which was presented this morning, looks at poverty, coverage of poverty versus coverage of low income, and coverage of income inequality, how often those words pop up. And those are key words in our times here now. And Tamar, tell us what you thought about the poll. And
Sure.
anything you thought that it revealed and what it might have missed.
Sure. Well, just, a word, I'm a recovering journalist, went over to the dark side about, I guess it was 15 years ago now, and I run a nonprofit here in town focused on what I call opportunity issues. And full disclosure, I'm a Republican and center-right, and, I don't think that in any way diminishes my commitment to caring about these issues. I've spent my whole life writing about race and immigration and opportunity. But so, really, my reaction to the poll in a way has been, or not poll, whatever it is, survey count, has been underscored by everything everyone said here, which is that there's a lot of coverage of poor people in America and working class people in America that doesn't call itself a poverty story or an income inequality story. I mean, you have healthcare, you have opioids, you have, tax stories now. Half the tax stories are about the effect on, what's going to happen to the child tax credit and how's that going to affect people. Immigration, those are poor people. So, I would say there's a lot of coverage in the press of poor people and indeed working class people, which I think is part of the new poverty that doesn't go under your terms. So I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think that affects maybe those small town papers. I'm not sure they're getting much of that, but I think the rest of us think a lot about poverty, and I mean the rest of us, the person you're sitting next to on the plane, or the person who's the common man. And I think I agree, people care about the issue. I think the public is as sick as we are of the latest tweet and the latest hissy fit. I think we do a lot of focus groups, and you find people want to wrestle with the topics and they want to know what people think about it. So I'm a little less gloom and doom than the survey or the.
Thank you very much. Marisol, from your vantage point, first of all, tell us a little bit about the Center for Community Change, and also, how do you feel about the way poverty is covered?
Yeah, so Center for Community, first of all, thank you very much for having us all here. We really appreciate it. But the Center for Community Change is a national social justice organization, and we really our focus is really all about empowering low-income communities, especially communities of color. And we do that in a variety of ways. We organize communities, we do policy work on the Hill, and we have a whole team of writers, and this is where I come in. We have an entire team of writers that focus on telling the stories of what it means to struggle to get by in this economy. And so our writers and photographers and videographers live across the country. They write stories, they write journalistic third-person stories, they write opinion pieces, they write essays, they tell video stories, they have blogs. And so we're really looking at different ways that their voices particularly, and that this issue particularly, can rise from the perspective of people who are actually living it, and so that it's not at the 30,000-foot policy level, but it's people here who are living this every day, who are the people, being talked about on airplanes, or, that the latest policy is being talked about or affecting them. They're writing about how this affects me, right? And so in terms of how I think coverage is happening in terms of policy, poverty, this is one of the reasons why we created this team, right? I mean, because we don't feel that it's being covered enough and with enough scope and with enough context, and that this is a concern that folks will often hear, is that you're not hearing as much from the voices of the people that are living this every single day. And so our solution to that was very much around how do we create a program or something that will give tools to the people that are living this to be able to have their voices heard, and that they become leaders and voices in this space. And so we have writers one of our writers actually has a book that's going to be coming out about her experiences as life as a maid, as a house cleaner in Montana. She's a single mom living in poverty with 2 kids, and she's a writer. Her name is Stephanie Land, and now she has a memoir, a book coming out with Hachette Groups, Hachette Publishing. We have another writer who is a journalist, and she's covering inequality in Memphis with a group called MLK 50. And so she created a news site called MLK 50, looking at 50 years after the death of Martin Luther King, what's happening in Memphis, the place where he was killed, on the very issues that he was fighting for. And so we're really looking at this issue from a lot of different ways. And the last thing I will say is that we work with a lot of partners. We have the creators of the work, but we do not have a platform. And we work with a lot of partners like Talk Poverty, and you can tell by the name that their focus is all about poverty, right? And looking at how you talk about poverty from a lot of different perspectives. We have partners like Equal Voices, right, that do a very much a similar kind of work. And so we work with a lot of publishers and organizations. We've been published by Vox and other news sites that are looking to help raise the voices of these folks.
Very good, thank you. Sam, there's a lot of talk about how well how well the media are covering these issues. I think in terms of, you're a health specialist, for example. I think about how how polling shows significant numbers of people who were opposed to Obamacare didn't know that Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act are the same thing. You know, I've got that ACA, boy, I'm sure glad I ain't got that Obamacare. It's really, that's really terrible out there, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this was being heard a lot in West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky. Do you think, is this the media's fault? I know we all love to blame the media for everything.
Yes and no. I mean, I think policy coverage, news coverage that is accessible and that would get that right and explain to you what this law is, what it's called, and what it does. I think that segment of journalism is stronger now than it's been, at least in my lifetime. We are committed to it at Axios. Vox does a great job. Even places like Politico invest pretty heavily in that kind of journalism now. There's more of it than there used to be. To some extent, the problem that you mentioned specifically is healthcare is just inordinately complex, and you can spend your whole life trying to
Who knew it would be so
the healthcare system.
complicated?
Exactly. And the politics of it also play a role in that. We are only so powerful to override, a political message that people, especially in those states, hear over and over and over again. So I think we are all fully committed, and I think there are more of us who are committed than have ever been committed to it before, to providing clarity on that. Clearly it's not breaking through as much as it ought to, so that's not to say I guess our job is done here, because we're trying. There's obviously more work to do, but I do think that we are, as an industry, on the right trajectory and have our goals are in the right place.
Right.
Laura,
what do you think?
Yeah, I want to jump in. So I agree. Actually, I agree with everything Sam just said about there's more and better policy coverage coming out of Washington than certainly, say, 10 years ago. I do want to connect the question of citing the poll of people not knowing about Obamacare versus ACA and this urge, I think, in Washington to point and laugh at people. A story that was revelatory to me that we did right after Election Day was there was this question of why do people who are on Obamacare, why did they vote for Donald Trump? And we talked to policy experts in Washington, and they gave this answer of people don't know they use Obamacare, they don't know what it is, they don't understand. And what we did was we picked a state, which was Kentucky, where it was the perfect place in terms of most people highest number of people who voted for Trump and were on Obamacare. So we sent Sarah Cliff, our lead healthcare reporter, out there, and what she did is she asked them, why did you vote for Donald Trump? And she did it while they were signing up for Obamacare. And she sat there with them, and what she found was policy analysts in Washington, were wrong. And I think the poll is probably right. People don't know maybe the difference between ACA and Obamacare, but what these people said was, I sign up for Obamacare. Some people said it's better than what I used to have, but universally what they were saying was, I'm paying for this thing, but I'm still too poor to use it. My deductible is so high, I can't use this health care. So what good is it to me? Meanwhile, they see Medicaid and they say, and some of these people have been on Medicaid, they lost their job at some point, and they said, Medicaid is great. And I work, and I'm not entitled to it. Yes, I voted for Donald Trump. He said he's going to get rid of this terrible system, and he's going to give me something better. And I think that by really, I just to echo what Marisol was saying about connecting real people's voices to what we know about policy is really important. I wish Vox did even more of this. We're trying. I mean, it takes a lot of resources to send somebody out to a state. I mean, it's not that expensive to send someone, to another, but it is. And I have to make that choice if I'm not going to have this writer here for a week while she's out talking to Trump voters. But, to me, what's important here is to think about that. And so I just wanted to kind of agree with Sam.
That's a good point you raised about how we read the polls, how we perceive them. Because you're absolutely right. If you only give people a choice of, do you like Obamacare, yes or no, they like the idea of it, but they can't afford it because the deductible's too high, but the poll doesn't cover that. Everybody wants to jump in on this one now. Jesse, I'm going to call on you next, and then Tamar. Go ahead.
Because I just want to bring this up as this is part of the problem we have in journalism with writing about poverty, is that a lot of the time we hold up people for either ridicule or sympathy, and they don't want either. They just want their story to be told. I'm originally from Mississippi, and people from Mississippi will still groan when you say the word sugar ditch. Because when Robert Kennedy came down to Mississippi on his poverty tour, which a friend of mine is actually writing a book about that right now, it painted the entire state as a state of know-nothing, broke people. And to this day, people will react badly when you talk about that. The same thing happened in New Orleans after Katrina. An actual industry came up of poverty tourism, of people driving through the devastated parts of the Ninth Ward, looking at how bad people were living after Katrina. People don't want their stories to be held up for ridicule or for sympathy. They want people just to know what they're going through, but a lot of times, especially for those of us who live inside the Beltway, we write about these things from the 30,000-foot perspective, and we say, well, look at how those people are living. But no one wants to tell their story and have it come out like that. They just want people to know what's going on, but we don't always do a great job of telling these stories correctly, where it actually brings about a change and not just, oh, look at how bad they are doing.
Good point. Tamar?
Well, that wasn't what I was going to say, but I think the issue there is dignity. Treat them as if they're going through something and give them their dignity and their voice, which is different than they're the microbes under the microscope or something. But I was going to actually talk about something else, which is Sam and Laura have talked about, sort of new, more policy-oriented journalism. There's also a whole world now of social science research that is closely focused on the news and policy, right? We're not back in the 1950s when the affluent society woke all of America up to poverty. Go to Brookings, go to AEI, go to any number of think tanks around town. There's robust debate and serious, data and awareness and policy thinking, and it seeps into the media, kind of not quite on the front page, not sometimes in the paper, but on the blog, sort of. And I think part of what journalism might do better is make that connect more. You know, sometimes a story seeps through, like Deaths of Despair, you know, got to the front page. But, you know, there's a lot of other interesting stuff going on. And you know what, you can't cover it as statistics or data or scholarly work, but I think there's a way to cover it that's about, you know, there's smart people on both sides that are having debates about this, and it's that having, you know, not necessarily answers, but something to say. You know, I think a lot of the discussion there, again, doesn't get in, and I think that's a problem. That's a resource, I guess, maybe is a way to think of it. Not a problem, but a resource we could all be using more to get these stories in.
Good point. Marisol, you specialize in that grassroots reporting there. What do you think of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to piggyback on what Jesse said, but also this gets to Tamar's point as well, which was very well taken, was this idea of context, is that a lot of times, I mean, we really do, media often will portray folks as either moochers or victims, right? And so it's hard when we tell the story of people, or it's policy, and there it's win or lose. Who's going to win? Who's going to lose? And so when you paint things in these really black and white ways, it's hard to get the context of everything. And so to me, that part of this idea of poverty porn, right, which is, oh yes, we're getting the voices of people, but then folks complain that it's poverty porn, and the issue is really around context. Who are people? They are not they by themselves over here. You know, we are Americans, and there are folks that are struggling to get by, and they're good people, they're bad people, they have kids, they struggle with childcare, they come from another country and are foreign born. They are trying to buy a TV, making $15 an hour, the same that other people are trying to buy TVs, making a little bit more. I mean, we all have very similar issues, we don't have similar issues, but we have similar views in terms of what we want, right? We want what's best for our families, we want what's best for ourselves and our kids. And so when we can approach folks in this way, it helps us to get some of this context that you are talking about, Tamar, but then also avoiding the poverty porn. A context to me is really key. And so when we look at, for example, our group, they're building up. I mean, we have a dedicated team of people who are writing about this issue from perspectives of, you know, what it means to have childcare, and, you know, should we have a childcare subsidy? When you are a mom somewhere in rural America and you can't afford it and there's no subsidy for you, then isn't it interesting that parents then end up doing swaps, right? Or they do trades, right? So if you come and take care of my kid today, I'll wash your clothes on Monday, right? I mean, like, that's American life today. And so having that context, I think, avoids the very thing of, you know, folks are either moochers, victims, or we're going to make fun of them.
But one of the hardest things that especially we have in the current state of the media is providing context with quickness.
Correct.
Because we're in a 24-hour news cycle that the news demand is that it has to be written right now, and it takes a special skill to be able to provide instantaneous news and context at the same time. And so one of the things that we've had to convince our editors on the race and ethnicity team is that we can't put out things immediately. We're going to have to take a second and figure out what's going on before we say something. And which, by the way, we're AP, so we had incredible pushback on us. Well, why aren't our stories coming out immediately? Well, we sort of need to figure out the context of what's happening. But especially with television, radio, and internet, news on the internet, we're all pushed to write as quickly as possible and add context in later. But later, usually you're on to the next story. So you never get back to that context. So one of the things that we're having to learn to do is actually slow down the news cycle to make sure that our stories have the proper context when they actually go out.
But I think that's the key to having someone who covers poverty specifically, or wealth and class, because that's someone that whenever there's a tax story and somebody wants to mention EITC, they don't have to look it up and take, you know, and take time to do that because they already know.
Right.
That gets back, though, to, I think you brought up the point about siloing your beats. This is an ongoing debate. When I was coming out of J school back during the Jurassic period, we were talking about horizontal versus vertical coverage. Remember that? You know?
Oh, yeah.
It's the same debate, but just different terminology and different times, because When blogging became a hot item that was supposed to replace all of us, a new ethos emerged that said, get it out fast. Don't worry about accuracy, because the great thing about blogging is you can come back and correct it later. Right? So you kind of have this rolling reporting going on whereby, depending on when you dip into it, you're going to get a different set of facts. But now apparently you're trying to slow things down, which reminds me of Ray Charles doing the slow reading commercial on Saturday Night Live many years ago. So I said, I got blisters on my fingers before I went over to Evelyn Wood's slow reading for Braille. So it's, but now we have slow news.
Right. Well, not too slow. Because we still have to compete with everyone else, but it's more of making sure you have the context as well as the content.
Right.
Because a lot of times people read the first version of whatever goes out and they don't read anything else. Next time they dip into it is like the next month. So we have to be sure the first thing we say has context as well as the content that people want, or you end up causing more damage than not writing about it at all.
Well, I'm going to ask Sam and Laura, do you feel that kind of pressure in your operations?
Certainly, yeah, pressure to have context, but I think sort of across the whole media landscape, there are a lot of different ways to add value. Speed is one. If you are breaking news, beating somebody else by 10 seconds on a press release used to be sort of what speed meant, and I don't think it is really anymore. So, an authentic scoop, breaking news that truly was not known before, is one way. Having, a smart analysis on, okay, this fact is out there. You might have heard that fact, but here's what it means. Here's why it matters. Even something as simple, and this is something that we work on a lot, as just, all right, you hear these sort of statistics. What if we can find some way to visualize them in a new way that just helps the reader really take them in? Explanatory journalism, I think, has a lot of that. So I think, there's one pressure in this company over here and one pressure in that newsroom over here, but broadly, I think people are being rewarded for bringing something new and unique to the table, that someone who cares about this issue was like, oh, I didn't think about it that way, or I didn't understand that particular component, and then that can be very helpful, because it can take some of the pressure off of you to always be the first. If taking 10 minutes to collect your thoughts or get a map together or something like that will actually differentiate you from the crowd. I think at Axios, and I think increasingly at a lot of places, we would rather be the smarter thing that people look to than just necessarily the first.
It's better to be accurate than first.
Yeah,
Right.
and
Laura,
not just
what do you-
accurate, but complete. Truly informative.
I would just say that any new successful, like you're talking about blogging and the age, and the Washington Post, the New York Times, they've all caught up to this game of let's be really fast. And so for Vox, there's little reward in that for us. I mean, you can get fast politics news anywhere. So for us, we have discovered that the best version of our explainers, we have a bit of a template that we do where we explain the news. And sometimes it's a controversy. We have an explainer on everything that's going on with Trump and the grieving families and Kelly, and you can read it all in one place and just know what's going on. It's a crazy story. So there you go. It's all there. And we add some political context and the rest, and you can get it all in one place. And what we found is those stories that are complete are going to do much better for us than just some commodity news of Trump just said this. We do sometimes do a mix. If we have something very quickly we want to say, we say it. If we have, if we see something first, maybe we'll write it up. But the place we win is by explaining the news really well and delivering on our mission. The other thing I want to highlight that we've learned at Vox is sometimes we think about we spend a lot of time thinking about what is the big dumb question here? What do people really want to know? You know, there's been, unfortunately, there are many shootings, mass shootings in the United States. And what we found is when a shooting happens, people want to know exactly what happened. But what we see in the next few hours is people want to know, well, why does this keep happening? How did this guy get a gun? And why? People are trying to understand the context in which this is played out. So this is both a very dark story, but what we do at Fox, we have a list, we have a literal spreadsheet of stories that we have already written and done very well. And we have an explainer that thoroughly explains the gun problem in the United States, looking at the policy, politics, and history that brought us to where we are. We have an explainer on why the NRA has been so successful in killing legislation. So we have a number of these stories. We put them up when these events happen. We add in this event happened, and they go viral for us every single time because we are asking the fundamental questions that people have about what's going on in the news. And for us, that's our winning strategy. It's how we've built an audience, and I don't think that for us, copycatting, being a copycat of speed is going to do nothing for us in a new age. So I think that the way to think about emerging news is the outlets that have a mission and fulfill it are the ones that are going to succeed. And I think you look at Axios, I get what their mission is. They're trying to reach influencers around politics and policy with exclusive information and with context. We're trying to reach a broad audience by answering big questions that people have. The AP still needs to be fast. That's what people count on the AP to tell us what is happening right now. And of course, there are other things the AP does as well, but I think we're looking at these different sort of outlets, and as we're thinking about poverty and how do you get these stories out there, I think my thinking for anyone who cares about the issue is to look at the organization and think, how could they do it best? And it's going to be different for every outlet.
Tamar, Spotlight on Poverty, which brought us all here today, prides themselves on having a non-ideological, non-slanted approach to the news. How much of an ideological issue do you see out there in the way these issues are currently covered?
Yeah, this is something I think a lot about because I often find myself on a panel like this or in a room like this where, you say R and people go, ooh. And I also try to do a lot of work where I bring center right and center left together. I think that's where the answers are, and that's something I spend a lot of my time and energy doing. I used to cite a phrase that Fiorello LaGuardia said, which was there's no right or left way to clean the streets. And I used to think, well, maybe, poverty policy or social policy sort of like that, like there's right way to do it and a left way to, there is no right and left way. Let's just solve it. I've come to think that's not true. I think, there are, right and left do differ in the values they bring to fighting poverty or helping the working class, and we even differ in the vocabulary. The right doesn't talk about income inequality, we talk about opportunity, and I don't think that's just a euphemism because we don't want to face up to income inequality. I think that's because that's how we think about the solution, is creating more opportunity. And I think the problem a little bit in the media, and it's not the level of the media here, but I think some of the media, paints it as if the people on the center left kind of have a monopoly on virtue on covering poverty and poor people, that they are the ones who are caring and compassionate and, want to help, and that people on the right are, penny pinchers or racists or, kind of, you name it, don't really want to help. And I think, there are people on the right who are penny pinchers and racists and what have you, and I'm not going to defend all of them. I'm not a Trump Republican. But I think there are a lot of people on the center right who really do care, and I think it's so much a man bites dog story that it doesn't really get covered. I mean, we had and not to toot my own horn, it's not about me, but we had a huge event last year where we had a whole day and a half of center-right thinkers thinking about poverty and inequality, from Paul Ryan to Charles Murray to the current researchers, and it didn't break through into the news. And so I think there's a robust debate to be had about what. I think there needs to be more coverage of the people on the center-right who care about poverty, and there needs to be a sort of a more kind of respectful of both sides picture of the debate, that there are people, child tax credit. There's a lot of people on the center right who want to help children, want to help families, think maybe that's not the best way, that maybe the EITC would get more money back into people's pockets. That's a perfectly legitimate view, and there ought to be more coverage of that fair debate, not just, the progressives are for the tax credit and, Republicans are penny pinchers who hate it.
I'd love to ask you a quick follow-up on that, because you and I have known each other a long time, and you're absolutely right. There is a very robust debate on the center-right looking at pragmatic responses to the poverty issues. And I've talked to Paul Ryan, Charles Murray, all the folks you mentioned, plus Bob Woodson I've known for 30 years, Center for Neighborhood Enterprise. And what disturbs me is, like your conference was last year before the election.
No, after.
After. Excuse me. Okay, I got my timelines mixed up. What I saw happening with the reconsolidation of the Republicans during the campaign and since, really, to a large degree, is a burying of that whole ideological segment or the whole segment of thinkers, what they're called. Conservacons, I believe, or something like that.
Reformicons.
I'm sorry?
Reformicons.
Reformicons, that's it, the reform-minded conservatives. I'm just not hearing them. A week or so ago, I heard a Trump official, a Trump administration official, question the EITC. The Earned Income Tax Credit, one of the most successful bipartisan anti-poverty programs out there, if you will. Is part of the fault within the Republican Party or within the whole conservative, the thinking conservative community?
Yeah, sure. I don't think I think there are a lot of Republicans who don't care as much as some progressives, right? There's a lot of Republicans who are about other things, and it's not their top issue. But there are, a good, healthy chunk that do care. I think we're all, and we've never broken through the way it would have been, I'd like to see us break through. Even the Reformicons, which sort of had their 15 minutes, it was really only 15 minutes. And, I think we've all had problems with, on a lot of issues, not just poverty, with Trump kind of overshadowing the sensible Republicans. Sensible Republicans, you can sort of put them in a phone booth at this point.
She said it, not me, ladies and gentlemen.
Those few are retiring. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean the thinking's not out there. And we have to, it's on us. We have to struggle to break through. It's my job. I have to break through. But it also would be good if we had more coverage.
Good, Dave. Well, Mario, so since you're sitting right next to her, I'd like to know what you think of that.
I agree. I think that this is the same. This is just a function of when you are working with 600 words or 30 seconds or 2-minute videos. You distill things to what you think is going to be, you distill things. And conflict is something that makes a story. Conflict, that's part of a story. If everyone is getting along, it's not really a story, right? But the very things that make a story also then take away the very context that we need, right? And that it's easy to say Republicans are this, Democrats are that, liberals are this, conservatives are that, or I'm sorry, conservatives are this, liberals are that. And so, it's, I think that's a function of how the media is moving and has always moved. Even when we had 40, 50, 60, 70 inches to tell stories, we still just always kind of sided on these, on two sides of a story. We always look at things very black and white, and I would just argue that, I'll repeat that, I think context for everything. That when your group got together and it was all sides, that's a robust debate that should be happening in this country, right? But it's a lot easier to say, these folks hate these people and these folks love these people. That's a lot easier, and we can say that in 500 words, right? In 10 inches, we get a quote from you, we get a quote from me, and then boom, we're done. But we're not really providing the context that's necessary, and so when you have people that are dedicated to writing about these issues, and maybe it's not just poverty, right? Like someone really dedicated to writing about wealth and class and what that means and how that plays out in our society, then I think we can offer context in a different kind of way. And so I think what's always missing is context. And I applaud, I'm familiar with a lot of what Vox is doing because their approach, that's not to say Axios and AP are not doing that, but certainly at Vox, their reason for being is around this very thing.
Well, Sam, Marisol mentioned a term that I love, poverty porn. It's been, I've heard it a number of times in referring to a certain kind of coverage. How would you distinguish poverty porn from good journalism or sound poverty coverage, if you will?
I think one of sort of a couple of things. And I know we'll get into this a little bit later, but one good way to avoid doing poverty porn would be for more of this coverage to originate from the communities that we're talking about. And the Vox piece on Kentucky was a great example of this. I'm from Kentucky. 1 million healthcare reporters had gone to Kentucky before Sarah Cliff and written these horrible stories. They were condescending, they were patronizing, they were, look at these dumb people who don't want the healthcare they have. Sarah did an incredible job, mostly just because she's a good reporter. But it's really hard just for any human, I think, to drop in on a situation and understand it as well and all of its complexities as someone who was part of that community or part of that, whether it's a physical community, a part of the country, a life experience, So I think to the extent that it's people from DC and New York, even if they're well-intentioned, dropping in on other communities throughout the country, you're always going to need someone as good as Sarah Cliff is to cross, to get past the sort of inherent barrier of I'm writing about something that is just not part of me. And so to have more of it originate, I think, from the relevant community would go a long way.
Okay, Marisol and then Laura.
I'm sorry, I just want to, I'm going to push back just a little bit because I think that for journalists that this is an inherent skill that all journalists should have. That our ability to be able to understand and see that there is another way, I think is really integral to how we do our work. But the other piece of that I will say is, as a woman of color, I also think that we need to have a lot of really diverse voices in newsrooms, which I do think that's not to, and I want to be really clear that that's not to say that we need black and brown people to cover poverty because everybody who's poor is black and brown. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that we should have a diversity of political voices, of racial and heritage voices, of gender voices, that LGBTQT voices that can offer either these perspectives or that just are part of a newsroom. And I think too often newsrooms are only seeing things from one particular viewpoint, and then you end up relying on the Sarahs of the world to be able to say, oh wait, there is another way of looking at this, and that's not how we should be starting from there. We should be starting from, there's a diversity of voices that can say from the get-go on every story, hey, this perspective.
And let me just add a couple things onto what you're saying. In addition to racial, gender diversity, one of the things that we're bad at journalism right now is geographical diversity and economic diversity. Yeah. Because most journalistic organizations nowadays require you to have a college degree before they hire you. So that automatically brings in only one set of reporters. But those reporters may not be the reporters who've lived in those communities, because everyone can't afford to go to college. But that doesn't mean you can't be a good journalist. And especially geographical diversity, because I know I've found myself in several newsrooms during my career where I was the only Southerner. And I'm sure the same thing has happened to you. And so when we write stories about communities in the South or the West, it's usually someone from the coast dropping in to write about a community they know nothing about and having to learn it at the last second and trying to interpret it. So one of the things that we need to get better as an industry is including people with more geographical diversity and more diversity of economic background. I grew up on a farm. So I know a little bit more about agriculture than the normal journalist would because I grew up on a farm. But I'm not saying that people who didn't grow up in those areas can't write great stories about it. But people who grew up there can get past those stereotypes quickly and get to the actual root of what's going on instead of having to be taught and explained it by someone else who is from that community.
Well, Laura, in that sense, do you think a lot of reporters come into places to cover stories like this without asking the right questions?
I think that most journalists do come in to, there was a line that professor said. The professor at when I was in journalism school, she used to be at the business school, and she came to journalism school. She said, the business school students, they had dollar signs in their eyes, and the journalism school students have stars in their eyes. And there's this sense of, I'm going to go change the world. And that is the starting point. My experience, every I suppose, I don't know, the vast majority of people I know who are journalists, particularly policy journalists, really care about the world and want to make it a better place. That's why they're doing this. They believe that storytelling and giving people information is going to make things better. And so I do believe that's the starting point. To the question of whether we're doing a good job telling people stories, being in Washington and working here, it is a challenge because we are in Washington and I do send people out to parachute in. And it is a skill to have the ability to see around you and to have compassion for people who aren't just like you, and to be able to do that. It is not easy to teach. It's actually a skill. That's why, when we think about it, so many stories come out every single day, and most of them are garbage if you think about it. I mean, just look at the internet right now. There's 3 stories you want to read. So if you think about that, it's not, I don't want to say poor us, but I mean, as an editor trying to hire people, it's hard. You want to hire good people, and you also want to hire diverse people as well, and you want to find those people and bring them in as well. And that's been a huge challenge in our newsroom, a huge challenge of how do we create a pipeline of people who do have different perspectives, and it's something we're working on and trying to figure out how to do better because, I do believe that's right. If you have people who are seeing the news from different vantage points, you're going to have better stories and better storytelling. And there's all kinds of stories that I'm sure I just don't see as stories because I have my point of view in the world. I'm from a boring suburb, and weirdly, that's been an advantage in a lot of journalism. There's colleagues in my office who grew up in Manhattan who have never driven a car. I'm like, how do you don't even belong here. You don't even know what is happening. So. It is true that we are an odd group of people, but I do think that journalists are coming from a place of wanting to make the world a better place. And as the industry has declined, it's only getting harder. Like I said, if I have to take one of my people, Vox is relatively small. If I take one person and send them out to do a story, holding out my, tin cup or whatever, trying to find more stories to put on the website while that person is gone. So, I think there are a number of factors at play here around diversity and bringing in people who can see the stories we don't see. 2, how do we train people to do them well when we're shrinking and have fewer resources and have fewer editors than any newsroom I've ever worked in, just because that's the way the industry is trending. And 3rd, the people who, are parachuting in, how do you help them see and have compassion also requires training and help. And I welcome suggestions on that and how to be better at it. But I guess I come from a perspective of some sympathy for us in trying to do what we're trying to do.
Yeah. I'm, as part of the legacy press, I look around our newsroom and see lots of empty chairs like tombstones around me because of the drastic cuts that have gone on in this era. But we're in a time of great change. Tamara, I see you lunging for the microphone, please.
So, I mean, I totally agree with everyone's point of view, what everyone has said about the diversity, including the regional and the economic diversity. But I also, I mean, I think for the people parachuting in, you know, what I think everyone on this panel understands, but maybe other people don't understand, is people want to tell their stories, you know? I mean, one of my formative experiences when I was a young journalist was the columnist Anthony Lewis was kind of a mentor, and, you know, he told a story about when he first got his job at the New York Times, and he was a young journalist, and his editor said, you know, so-and-so died last night, and here's his widow, Mrs. So-and-so, you know, go interview her. And he said, you know, I absolutely will not do that. That's a terrible violation. You know, I'm not going to go and someone's grieving. Well, the guy said, you know, do it or you're not going to work here anymore. And he went, and the punchline was he couldn't get away because she wouldn't stop talking. And, you know, he was there sort of all evening. And people do want to tell their stories, and it's not always easy to take them in and get around their point of view. But you know, we just took a group of people, a group of, you know, of researchers, scholars to Louisville, and, you know, tried to meet working class people. And, you know, if you can just get them to not ask too many questions and listen, people want to tell their stories.
Indeed. Bill, I'm going to turn to the audience for questions. Here, you've all been very patient, and I would love to hear from you. Oh, here we go, right over here. Yes, go right ahead, ma'am.
Right. Hi, Monique Reiser, Executive Director of Opportunity Nation. We were on a panel together last year in
Right.
in Las Vegas.
Great to see you again.
And tomorrow another president. I'm so excited about this conversation. I really appreciate the comments around people who have lived experiences, doing some of the writing, and all the diversity issues. One thing that I would love to just sort of journalism 101, just get some reflection on is, who would you say, the audience is for these stories? Is it the elites to inform them of these lives? Or is it the voter to make informed decisions? Or is it, to give dignity to the real people living some of these challenges? I would just be curious your thoughts on that, taking into account you all have very specific audiences for your publications.
Good question. Who wants to respond first?
Well, I mean, I'll start because our audience is everyone. So we have to be sure that with everything we write, it's complete enough where everyone will understand it. One of the things that we actually brag about at AP is that our daily audience is half the population of the planet. So we have to be sure that we're explaining things that not only for the American audience, but for the Chinese audience, for the Indonesian audience, for the French audience, where we can, while trying to be as concise as possible, we're also trying to explain as much as possible at the same time. Which I will admit that we don't hit the mark 100% every time. But we don't specifically aim our stories at anyone. Our stories are for the general reading population of the planet. But that's just because of who we are and what we do. Other organizations have specific audiences. We really don't. Our specific audiences, if you can read, yes, we're aiming at a
I'm going to turn to Laura here. Go
I
ahead.
wish Vox reached half the planet, but we are writing for a broad audience. I think Sam will probably distinguish what that means, but when I'm picturing who we're trying to attract, I think about a person who has a job and is not looking at her phone, or she's not at a computer, she's living her life doing whatever job that is, and at some point is checking in, and ambient hears something is going on and just wants it all in one place to understand what's happening. The other way that I think about audience is just accepting the reality that half of our audience comes to us on their phone, on their device, and that includes Apple News, Google Newsstand. Some people are coming to our mobile website and thinking about, okay, well, how can I explain this, knowing where this person is and understanding that I want that person to share it with somebody else. So how compelling can I make this? So broad audience, understanding where they're coming from and how they're getting our information.
Sam? Who's your audience?
Our audience is a little bit different. I would say we start, sort of the core audience would be policymakers and then in Washington. From there, you sort of build out the business community. We do a lot of tech coverage, so sort of powerful people or elite people, I guess, but then expand all the way out, I think, just to politically engaged readers who may not work in politics, may not work in Washington, but have an interest in the subject matter. So I think our sort of ideal would be something, for example, with the Republican repeal and replace bills that were just on the floor, to have something very brief that says, all right, it cuts Medicaid in this particular way, right? Here's how that will affect these people in these states, give you sort of the real world impact as quickly as possible without explaining to the reader every in and out of Medicaid, but just here's something that you can use, whether you are just a person living your life wondering, is this going to take away my health care? Or if you are working on that bill and trying to figure out the political equities at stake.
Marisol, who's your audience?
Our audience varies. It just depends on what the issue is. So our audience will vary, but our goal is always the same. And the goal is always around having Americans, having politicians, politicians are mostly American, but having everyday people understand who lives in poverty, what their lives are like, that they are not some separate other group. They are your neighbors, they are your friends, they are the kids that your kids go to school with, they are the people you go to church with. I mean, our goal is always the same, and it's really around shaping what that narrative is, so that people understand and are educated about it, and are not also trying to get them out of the head of they're this, that, or the other thing.
So, I mean, again, I said this earlier, but I want to elaborate a little bit. I mean, I do really think that kind of ordinary people do care about kind of where the country's going. I don't think they care about Washington, and I think, they know the villain or the hero of the moment, but, and they don't know the name of the policy. But I mean, they do. I think especially in this time where there's so much change, people are worried about where the country's going. And, once upon a time I used to think, that kind of my peers, I used to say, the most burning issue in their lives was which bottle of $32 olive oil to buy. But I think, and, maybe there's still a class like that, but I think, we just did a series of focus groups about trade of all issues. And we did them in very ordinary places and tried to get, ordinary people, including non-college people in. And when you go to a focus group, you don't know if you're going to be talking about soap or cereal or an issue. So we weren't necessarily getting people who had any concern about politics, but a lot of them knew a lot about trade and had views about trade and cared about trade. I mean, trade of all issues. We're not talking race or immigration or healthcare or poverty. And they had a way that they connected it to their lives. So I think, people, the details of policy, I agree. Most people, a lot of the public doesn't care. The details of research, they certainly don't care. Who it is, they don't necessarily care. But people care about where the country's going. And it's not just like my pocketbook, it's where's the country going. And I think, we need to speak to that.
Well, folks back in my hometown, which is, for those of you who know, is the same hometown as J.D. Vance, author of Hillbilly Elegy. And a perfect example of industrial Midwest gone to seed from job loss. Folks know a lot about trade there because that's where their jobs went overseas. And it's a great issue to demagogue with people who don't really understand how trade works. And in politics, any way you can do it works, or at least that's how it is in Chicago. Maybe the rest of the country's different. We got hands up over here. Oh, let me see. Both you guys put your hands up at the same time, so I'm going to go to my left first. Yes, sir, and then you.
Thank you. Rick Ryback at Best Economics. I appreciate what you said about left and right approaching the issue differently. And one of the things that makes talking about poverty a little difficult, I think, is a little bit like race, because we pretend that we live in a colorblind society. That's part of our national mythology. So just to raise the topic indicates that you're challenging this mythology that we hold so near and dear. Likewise, we call ourselves the land of opportunity. So people who are poor, they're just not taking advantage of the they would tell you how sick they are, but I don't think they have a clue that their sickness was related to the dirty water they lived in because they've lived in it their whole life and they didn't know anything else. So I'm wondering how you approach this whole notion of opportunity and whether you see any systemic barriers to opportunity that create the poverty that we're all trying to.
I want to respond to the first half of your question, and then I think both of you are probably getting ready to respond to the second. I think what you were saying, just bringing up poverty in a story, is that saying, yeah, you're challenging kind of the American myth of equality and the American dream. So is that inherently, does that make you a leftist just to bring this up? And it goes back to, I think, coverage. The way I see coverage versus externally, how decisions and what I want to cover is perceived. And I just think we're in such a moment of extreme polarization. The example I like to use is this study. It was from a few years ago, and a professor showed a photo of a dog to people, a group of Democrats and Republicans, and said, do you like this dog? And most people said, yeah, I like that dog. It's a nice looking dog. It was, they described the owner as just, random person. Oh, that's a nice dog. And then they asked people, said, oh, this is Barack Obama's dog. What do you think of that? Half the people hated this dog, right? Like, suddenly people hate this dog. And it's like, there was this that is how polarized we've become, where people recoil at a photo of a dog if it's owned by a politician they don't like. So I do grapple with this question of how do we write about things that don't alienate? I want to reach, I'm trying to get the clicks, and I want to get them from wherever I can and reach as broad an audience as I can. And so how do you draw people in and get them to read along and respond? And there are signs where I'm hopeful. I think that publishing on different platforms like Apple News and Google Newsstand is diversifying our audience in terms of political leanings. Some of our explainers, I think, do that well. But it's just an issue that I grapple with, and I think that you're pointing out something very real about how polarization is affecting how we think about news and how newsrooms make decisions.
Any others? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think the question about the fish in the polluted water is fair. I think that's, and that's just a fact. Big forces, what are the big forces that cause something that people who are caught up in it often don't see? I think the right and the left, they have arguments about what those big forces are. They're obstacles to opportunity, but I think, the left thinks it's structural economics, and the right, I think, would say it's a mix of economics and, what people call culture. And I don't think that's necessarily blaming people. That's saying that, over the years, attitudes have built up where people get in their own ways, or communities get in their own ways. And I don't think there are too many people on the right who think it's only that. But of course there are barriers. We're just talking about what has trade done to some communities. Of course race has been a barrier. But I think there's still different ideas about how to help people deal with those barriers.
Thank you. Marisol, and then I'm going to go back to the audience for the next question.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to make three points in response. The first thing, when we talk about sort of fish in polluted water, we just had a conversation about how folks in the Midwest had an incredible amount of knowledge around trade, right? And these are folks that are living in that experience, and they had a greater amount of knowledge and come at it from a very specific perspective based on their lived experience. And so I would say that yes, even though they may be clouded in how they see what's happening, it's clouded by the fact that they have an experience, right? And so they understand that, and so I think that always needs to be a part of the conversation. Second thing is, in terms of a colorblind society, I think that we do like to, and maybe this goes without saying, right, that we as a nation like to think about ourselves that way, but in reality, we're not a colorblind society. And I think that part of breaking that down is saying we're not a colorblind society. We don't live that way. We don't experience the world in that way. There are very clear systemic barriers that affect how people live their lives, school to prison pipelines, criminal justice. I mean, there are some really clear systemic issues that we as journalists, I'm not a journalist anymore, but that journalists should be thinking about and looking at covering. Those are your explainers and those kinds of things that Laura was speaking about earlier. They're not always as sexy, right? Systemic barriers, systemic oppression.
No, they
that's-
can be. They do. They
can be,
succeed.
but a lot of people
No,
don't always think of them that way.
Yeah.
But I do think that is coverage that needs to happen.
I'm going to jump in though, just on this point, because I think that is the wrong way to think about it. That there is this belief in media.
I agree.
That
That's
if
my
we
point.
cover
No,
it,
no, I
that
agree.
it won't, that it's not sexy, it's not going to resonate, and I think that's wrong. And so
I
I think
absolutely agree.
I think that maybe you're framing it in this way of it's like either or, but I just disagree.
No, I agree with you, and I think that there's a lot of media now that are looking at sort of what that looks like. But there is still significant amount of media out there that is not always thinking about systemic issues as something that we should cover, because that's just the way it is. And so I'm absolutely in agreement with you, but I think that we need to be talking more about those systemic barriers. And the other part about, let me just go back to the colorblind society, is this idea that understanding and respecting and recognizing those experiences, I think also get us to some of what we're talking about.
Thank you. You've been very patient, sir. Go ahead.
John Toronto with Child Welfare League of America, and I've been following the opioid situation because potential impact on foster care and child welfare. But wondering, and I don't know if opportunity is the right way, but when I worked on the drug treatment issues in Michigan 25 years ago, when it was crack cocaine and it was urban and it was dealt with in a different way. Now I'm hearing some very conservative politicians talk about things like, well, my people in my district or state can't get jobs because they have drug tests. We're talking about drug treatment now. There was even an article at Politico or The Hill this weekend about needle exchange, and I think they singled out Hal Rogers as being opposed to it a couple years ago. Now he's very much for it. So I don't know if it's an opportunity, but I think it also taps into the racial issue. If there isn't a chance here to focus on poverty in a broader sense, because some people are now getting some of those poverty issues that they didn't get.
As part of that, now it's being treated as, drug addiction is being treated as a medical problem, health problem, instead of a criminal problem like crack was. Does that have, well, anyway, let me throw this to the panel. Who wants to respond to
I
this?
think that's right. I mean, I think that's right.
Your real question here, though, is does that relate back to the opportunity?
In effect, I think the way that the country looks at poverty now, since we're drilling down in ways, like I think the drug testing issue, because I remember 20 years ago and being in Congress and staff and the welfare debate where everybody was out there to, why we're going to make sure anybody who tests positive can't get higher ed, can't get TANF,
Right.
can't get any of these things. And now we're getting this different view about this other community out there that's confronting these very same issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the other thing is in some areas, everybody's got somebody related to them or someone they know or someone, I mean, it's so pervasive in some places that it's really hard to avoid. I think you still might have somewhat different answers, right? I mean, I'm not sure that the first thing the right thinks about is, waive the drug tests. But, I think there still might be a debate about what the solution is. But I think you're right. More people are focusing on it because it's in their district, it's people they know. And, I suppose, frankly, it's white people.
Well, I mean, as a longtime political reporter, it's probably pretty cynical to say this, but if you want a politician to care about something, show them how it's going to affect the people who vote for them.
Exactly.
And once they see
That's
how
called realism here in D.C.
once they see how their constituents, specifically their constituents who vote for them, care about an issue, then they'll care about it. It's a rare politician that cares about something that their voting population isn't clamoring about.
So it's our challenge as journalists then to try to get them engaged, make them care about it, a particular story.
I am hesitating because I would say our job as a journalist is to put the information out there. It's their job to decide whether they want to care about it or not. It's more of an advocate's job to make them care about it. Our job is to get the information to them.
Well, are there ways to get information to them that get them to care about it? In other words, back when I was working in TV, one of the senior CBS people called it getting them into the tent so you can sell them the snake oil.
No, I mean, it's literally our job to get the information out to the public. That's what we do. Our job is to inform and educate.
So it's a very passive role is how you look at it, as opposed to selling the story.
Making someone care about it, at least for us at AP, our job is not to advocate any issues. Our job is to put the information out there. It's the job of the advocates to make people care about it.
Gotcha. Anybody else want to respond to that? Oh, you want to respond to that? Okay.
I just wanted to connect the dots on something though, to my earlier question, I guess, was, what I didn't finish was why? Who's your audience and what do you want them to do? And so I feel like at some level, we as a community are deciding that we want someone to care about something by deciding to cover it, because there are millions of stories you could cover, but we choose to cover certain ones over others. So I think whether we realize it or not, journalism did it a million years ago, those gatekeepers are deciding what we want politicians to care about. So to some degree, right, by across the whole of the nation.
Very good. I think we had another hand over here. Yes, sir.
My name's Eric Van, I work with NASCASP, and we work with the Weatherization Systems Program and the Peace Services Block Grant, two of numerous anti-poverty programs that were zeroed out in the administration's budget. And there was a lot of really great coverage after the budget came out about the program, but it seems like anti-poverty solutions, social safety net only receives coverage once it's under fire. And so how does media play a role in increasing the general knowledge of the general public, the policymakers, day-to-day how these programs work and the value that they have? And to Tamar's point about kind of center right, some of those folks are the ones that have defended these programs and ensure they get funding, and that's because they understand how the programs work and that they fit with that conservative approach to tackling poverty. So kind of what role does media have there, and how do you combat these old tired framing of the social safety net and not necessarily knowing what burns through what and how those actually help?
Yeah, I think that is really a hard challenge because it's so arcane. I mean, the EITC and TANF and the it comes up when there's a fight over it. Partly because it's so complicated, and also because if it's kind of working, it's not a story. So I think that's a challenge, and I guess it's for the it's for the Voxes of the world to kind of find the hooks, right? So it's like when that aren't necessarily when it's going to get destroyed, but other hooks, and it's not easy. But I mean, I think that is part of the challenge.
I mean, I think that I agree. I mean, the reality is, we have an EITC explainer, and we throw it out there every time we think we can ride the wave when there's something in the news. I mean, it's just reality. It's very hard to get someone to care about a random thing. Though at the same time, I've been very surprised in the last few years how much profiles of things that work, especially in other countries, are really appealing to people. Sweden doing anything, people just want to know. And people are interested in things that work. We did another story that I wasn't sure how it would go. It is a story about how California has been much better about combating maternal mortality than other states, and why that is. And we kind of profiled this one doctor and what he's been doing in California. And it was nuts. People really wanted to read this because it's sort of an issue that people are sort of aware of. And then by profiling something that maybe seems helpful or is working well, is appealing to people. I mean, I know that probably still creates the same, even though it's not the old trope of conflict. It's still, we are shining light on perhaps things that are working when there's a huge problem. So I don't know. There are pro and cons on everything, but I do think that you have to come up with ways to bring people along, and it's just how the humans like stories, and
the public keeps saying that they're tired of the conflict and they want to know what works. I mean, I think the test is, do they read it?
Yeah, and I think you can. You have to make it compelling to people. But yeah, two things can be true at once. Trust me, like conflict stories, people are interested in those too. So So,
Yeah, and the flip side, an old mentor of mine said, news is what's happening when things aren't going the way they're supposed to. In other words, nobody cares about the thousands of planes that take off and land safely every day, or the thousands of teenagers who don't fall into drugs, and et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of, it gets back to what I was saying earlier about getting people into the tent. Because I found this, Tamar, with people I know who are involved in pragmatic programs with bipartisan support that work. Nobody notices because nobody cares. It's like, okay, well, that's working, good. Let's go to this one. That's a total catastrophe. So this is kind of why, Jesse, I was harping on getting people into the tent, because you have the big story. Within the way our newsroom values work every day, the kind of stories that are the good news stories aren't always the ones that are going to grab people as being a good page one story. They think of that as being back in the Metro section somewhere.
Oh, no, I completely agree. Even though in Washington today, it would be a story if everything worked the way it was supposed to.
This is so true.
Yeah, we haven't seen that in a while. If everything worked, it would actually be a story. That would be the front page story. But, I mean, really, conflict does create stories. That's what we want to read as readers. But we do have to do a better job at pointing out the things that do work. We do have to do a better job as journalists to point out, to actually say to Americans that, things are not completely falling off the cliff, even though the way we presented things are falling off the cliff. It is part of our job as journalists to reflect, to inform and educate, but sometimes, especially these days, it's almost getting to a point where our job needs to be to reassure.
Well, yeah, if we can feel reassurance ourselves, that's another story.
Yeah.
Anyway, do you have a question, or you want to tell me that we're running over time? Okay. That's great. Thank you very much. You all have been a terrific audience, let me say, first of all, and the time has just whizzed on by, and I didn't realize it, so thank you for your patience. And Shelley, please step right up. Great to see you.
I just want to do a quick close and say thank you to this fabulous panel. I have to say, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling much more optimistic about the state of journalism and the ability to really do a deep dive on these particular sets of issues. So thank you again, and thank you, Clarence, for your great moderation. I also want to just thank the Spotlight team, which I'm proud to be a part of. We, again, at Spotlight are trying very hard to elevate smart story writers like the ones here, people who are really trying to tell the context of a story and not just get there first. And really also just want to thank the Spotlight community, which is you, and I hope if you're not a part of the website that you sign up and join in. Really, I think what the Spotlight community is trying to both provide a clearinghouse for these stories that provide the depth and complexity that we know need to be told, but to increasingly try to provide some clarity around these issues, to crowdsource these good ideas. You don't have to go all the way to Sweden to find solutions. We're trying to lift them up in the communities from partners all across the country. So if you run a nonprofit, or you're working in community, or you're a voice of journalism, trying to lift up those stories, Spotlight should be a place that you're sending ideas and stories and reports so that we can be lifting up your voices. And we're also trying to create this civil discourse between left and right, because I think it's actually, as Laura was pointing out, a little bit of a counter-narrative that gets some attention when you're actually showing, hey, here's somebody from the center left and somebody from the center right who agrees on a particular policy issue or on a particular problem. So while there's a lot that we don't agree on, there are places where on this particular set of issues we can come together and we can make a difference for low-income families. So another platform source is Spotlight, and sort of lifting up those issues. And lastly, I just want to say, I think the Spotlight community, which we're continuing to build and is only here because you've continued to come back to the site and really trying to engage journalists, philanthropy, poverty leaders across the country, just to know that we actually do have a shared perspective. And as to Monique's point, I think we are trying to get people to care about these issues because ultimately we do believe collectively in the American dream. We might not all agree on how to make this a more perfect union. We might have debates on exactly which issues, which policies, but I do think our shared values are what hold us together. And we hope to continue for another 10 years to provide a platform and a place and conversations like this to continue into the future. So thank you for spending your Monday morning with us, and thanks again to this great panel.